and welcome to another episode of Anarchism on Film, a series on this channel where I talk about film and how radical and anarchist politics show up. And for reference, I love cinema. I watch cinema all the time. I came up from 2017 onward as a freelance writer and wrote a lot about gender representation, radical representations in films like Waves, Black Panther, and so many others. And I recently saw One Battle After Another, directed by Paul Thomas Anderson, starring Leonardo DiCaprio, Regina Hall, Sean Penn, Chase Infinity. Cinema isn't just entertainment, it's a lens of revolt. In this series, we trace the sparks of anarchism on film, from quiet gestures of defiance to full-blown rebellion. Watch the screen become a stage for freedom. Anarchy on film isn't chaos. It's a message. This series unpacks movies that challenge power, question authority, and imagine a world beyond control. Get ready to see rebellion in action. And I have a lot of thoughts about the movie. Didn't know much about this movie. I knew it was kind of about revolution. I knew that there was a lot of flack around Leonardo DiCaprio and his stances on Israel. But I recently did a podcast interview with Seeds of Revolution. My interviewee on that podcast was just like, you need to see this movie. I think radicalism shows up in film so often, but we seldom have deep and nuanced critiques or analyses of these films from organizers, from radicals, from revolutionaries. And I think there are a lot of missed opportunities. And One Battle After Another is a prime example of a missed opportunity for me. One Battle After Another is a 2025 action thriller, political satire, and comedy hybrid written, directed, and produced by Paul Thomas Anderson. It's loosely inspired by Thomas Pynchon's 1990 novel, Vineland, and plot centers on Bob Ferguson, a former revolutionary for the French 75, who in the beginning of the film has this intense action on this detention facility and ends up meeting Prefedia Beverly Hills, who is played by Tiana Taylor. They have this explosive affair, and during this direct action in the beginning, they meet this military leader who's played by Sean Penn that Prefedia has this really weird, intense, explosive moment with. And then we get a montage of the French 75 doing very militant direct actions, calling in on payphones, warning businesses, politicians about the sins of the government, the sins of corporate America, the sins of imperialism, and doing bombings of various buildings and very militant direct actions and also expropriation. Then the French 75 is eventually scattered because of repression. Prefedia Beverly Hills goes on the run. Bob Ferguson also flees alone with his daughter. And years later, Stephen Lockjaw, this fascist military guy, comes back with a force and wants revenge 15 or 16 years later. And the rest of the movie is pretty much this intense cat and mouse game. Bob Ferguson is trying to get to his daughter. Steve Lockjaw is on this whole fascist mission with this secret white supremacist group within the government and corporations that are able to do all kinds of things extrajudicially. And the movie is a classic cat and mouse game. We have a lot of comedy. We have Bob Ferguson trying to navigate all these different environments to get to his daughter. We realize how much of a bumbling revolutionary he is. Sean Penn's character, Stephen Lockjaw, is really stoic and scary. And the people that he's talking to in this Christmas group are just very, very odd and very, very weird. And the film has received a lot of praise. The film ranks highly on Rotten Tomatoes, has a 96% review. I'm just going to start off by saying that I really did not like this movie. I left giving it a 4 out of 10, and then I demoted it to a 3 out of 10, and then I came home, and then I was angrier, and my 3 out of 10 solidified, even though I don't know if it's the most fair review because of how much I really wanted the depictions of radical politics, the explanation of these characters' impulses to be a bit more grounded. And what I find interesting is that it's based off of an original text that has critiques that the movie kind of melts away from and sort of shifts the narrative into something that's a bit different. I thought it was interesting to see a movie in the modern age that shows some of the Weather Underground's tactics. I thought it was extremely captivating to see the Act One montage and to really have a visual depiction of what this kind of radicalism is like. I think the biggest thing in the movie that I found interesting that I'm anticipating talking about on the podcast that I'm going to be doing soon is the subversion of how Prefedia Beverly Hills reacts to motherhood and the trappings of domestication near the end of Act 1. And I've talked about this a bit in my Asada Shakur video about how reading her memoir taught me a lot about gendered radical literature. There is this trope of the revolutionary man who's strong and strong-willed, and then a woman falls in love with him, and he's so bullheaded, and then eventually him and his partner end up getting pregnant. And there's this whole trope in a lot of these films about like the guy being brought to task and whether or not he can calm down and if this is the right kind of life to bring a child into. But to not give you too many spoilers about Act 1, Prefedia's journey to motherhood is something that becomes a major plot point in the later half of the film. And I think the reason that she flees and abandons her family in the way that she does is an interesting subversion of the expected patriarchal abandonment that we see in a lot of revolutionary narratives. The man usually leaves, he usually gets incarcerated, he usually gets killed at the end, as I've seen in a lot of like Black Hood and like Jamaican cinema.
No, you can't come with me. You have to stay and take care of Kimala, right?
Why?
You just can't come.
Yes, Dad.
Kimala.
When am I going to see you again?
Soon.
And this film subverts that by having Prefedia be a bit selfish, by having her be really committed to the revolution, by having her postpartum depression, in my mind, also activate this underlying jealousy that Bob Ferguson, her partner, is not really as in love with her. He just sees her as a piece of flesh. And eventually she flees, and this sets in motion a really intense dynamic from here forward for the film. Do I love this plot point? No. Did I find it interesting because it forces the other characters around her to contend with her abandonment, especially her daughter? From watching interviews and knowing a bit about his cinema, he is known for tackling subject matter in interesting ways. But I felt like the comedic tone in certain parts of this movie really pulled away from some of the power that the politicality of the movie could have had if it had just been dug into quite a bit more. I do think it would have been interesting to see her come back later on or see her contend with her past dilemmas and issues. If we're thinking about radicalism and someone getting entrapped up in the state and then fleeing, it does make sense that they're not going to be heard from again, like the film kind of shows. Even this subversion, I felt, only handed the film over to what Act 2 and 3 would be, which is essentially a giant cat and mouse game that felt somewhat very, very predictable. I'd say that's the main thing I thought was interesting about the film. I mean, other than that, I have a lot of bad things to say. And a lot of it is going to be hinged on the question of why is this movie being made now? And why is it being made in a time of rising fascism? What are the failed messages, the failed opportunities that this film could have explored? And it's usually when I watch media that involves some kind of radicalism but misses the mark, or the story is centered more on an anti-hero or a really solipsistic or self-centered character, although the film is about some assemblage of collective struggle. And I think that's where some of the tension in this film lies. It's expressing a sort of collectivism in the beginning in terms of French 75, but it's like, bam, bam, boom, we're here for the revolution, no people, no bars, blah, 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 blah. But I'm like, where's the program? We see a lot of the spectacalism. We see them talking on their radios or using code words for their phones or doing militant actions in Act 1, unmasked, uncovered up. What is this trying to say about radicalism? What is this trying to say about fascism? And if it's not really trying to dig into saying anything particularly clear and effective and interesting on a radical level, why is this movie showing a radical space? A lack of revolutionary research or materiality, spectacalism instead of substance. And this was very evident in the first act. Tiana Taylor looking sexy in her tight jeans. Oh my God. Boom, boom, boom. Y'all are gonna give me your money. Give me your money. Leonardo DiCaprio slapping her butt. Everyone's doing all these actions unmasked. And I get it. There are the rules of cinema and you suspend the laws of the world or whatever. But if this is based on the Weather Underground, why the fuck are they going in unmasked? And granted, maybe I need to look more into Weather Underground expropriations and whether or not they were disguises or whatever. But in terms of just like a general radical ethic, militant action usually doesn't happen when you're going in completely unmasked. And then the fact that they were able to do different actions where they were able to get into government buildings and do this and yada, yada, yada. And maybe it is emblematic of the Weather Underground's era. And I think the difference is like they had different levels of surveillance, like technology and CCTVs. And so theoretically, for someone from the Weather Underground who's on the run to be able to put on a little disguise or some makeup and going into a building, their level of trackability then in the 60s, 70s would be completely different than the people in this movie who are highly sought after fugitives walking into government buildings and setting things off like it's a movie. It's a movie, but this movie treats it like a movie. And when I say lack of revolutionary research, the beginning felt like these beats of spectacalism. We got to see these shots of the bombings. We got to see them rushing in and having this nearly perfect militant action. We get to see the zany white dude who joins the crew and is able to set things off with bombs and the little whatever, the fireworks that he has. It's a radical film set in the US and it's a white person writing it. They're most likely going to lean into using the Weather Underground as their model. And this is something that I felt throughout a lot of different radical movies that I've seen. And I've talked about on the Dugout podcast, especially when I saw Judas and the Black Messiah for the first time. What confused me about that film is that it was a film about Fred Hampton and his assassination and his legacy and his work. But instead of zooming out and showing the fullness of his career, the fullness of his upbringing, the fullness of what led him into being the revolutionary that he is, it zoomed into the darkest period of his life, the period of his life where he was experiencing the most repression and state violence. And there's even a scene in the film where a Black Panther that is killed by the state, his mother is grieving. Fred Hampton goes to her and she basically says, all they're going to remember of my baby is that he's a monster. And it makes me think about how so much of what I consider to be less consciously researched radical cinema, it's about these moments of spectacalism as opposed to the humanity and the systemic reasons and inclinations that would lead people to revolutionary and militant direct action. We zoom into the beginning and we see these fully realized revolutionaries. We zoom forward and we see the consequences of their life, but we don't really get to see the considerations and deeper things that go into why they do the militant work that they do. Even Prefedia Beverly Hills, like it would have been good to have a scene with her and her mother where we kind of get the context of the fact that she's a part of this chain of revolutionaries. But the film had this forward momentum because it was leading towards this cat and mouse kind of plot in Act 2 and 3, that it didn't really allow for us to be really grounded in the characters and their dedication to revolution. And the montages, the sexiness of the beginning, that falls away to the ever-present nature of this fascist military character, Stephen Lockjaw, in Act 2 and 3. And so the power imbalance in terms of what radical representation shows up feels kind of off to me. Throughout the film, the radicals don't feel as effective against the state as I would like to see a movie coming out in 2025 as the radicals could be. Because like this movie could be a really inspiring note. And this goes into kind of my second qualm with the film. Well, I can't say this is a bad movie. I think sometimes really amazing writers, directors, producers can take a very clear plot and turn it into this epic, make it grand, make it this beautiful thing. And that's funding, that's legacy, that's all these things. But it doesn't mean that the film might be as engaging on a writing and predictability level as it could have been. I think there may be some more elements they could have thrown in to Act 2 and 3 that would have made the cat and mouse game a bit more interesting. I think the radicals and militants theoretically could have put up more of a fight, and that would have made for a more interesting plot than the fascists, than the state, than this white supremacist group kind of pulling the strings behind the background, and that being the secondary antagonistic force next to Steve Lockjaw himself as an individual. And so the writing made me feel like, okay, Bob Ferguson is trying to find his daughter, and so Stephen Lockjaw is also trying to find Willa. And by the end, we know they're all going to find each other, and I assume this film isn't going to off a 16-year-old, so it's just going to have to happen how it's going to happen. And I also, just watching the film, I didn't have any inclination that anything bad would really happen to Leonardo DiCaprio. And so the cat and mouse effect of it all, I think, just kind of devolved the second and third act into waiting for the inevitability of the conclusion, as opposed to there being things happening along the way that would have felt a bit more unpredictable, or people putting up more of a fight or having more capacity. And this is aside from the Mexican characters in the film, the Central and South American characters, like I can't remember his name, but it's the sensei in the film who has this like undocumented immigrant fleeing system that is really, really expertly and really coolly depicted in the film, which I will say was a highlight. It was a highlight, but it was not a highlight in the sense of like, I want the movie to be about these people that are helping immigrants escape, not bumbling Leonardo DiCaprio falling off a roof and getting arrested. Yeah. What does a film like this say about fascism? And what I mean with this is that by the end, not to give you too many spoilers, the main fascist antagonistic character, Stephen Lockjaw, meets his end by many of the decisions of the other fascists around him. I think the message that sends, and it's interesting, if you make a fascist a villain in a radical film and the fascist keeps coming back, they're almost like mythic, they're almost like unstoppable. Within the framework of fascism, a fascist might be able to see this film and be like, oh yeah, we're so strong, oh my God, we're unstoppable, we're essentially immortal. And if we're living in a time of rising fascism, where that involves loyalism, it involves populism, it involves a belief in this mythic father-like figure who can return us to the classicalities of a white ethno-Christian kind of gender dynamic. Yes, that is very clearly the symptoms of the fascism that we're seeing. Yes, that has been studied and understood. Why can't this form of fascism be more effectively fought against in cinema? Why does it have to be that the state comes in with immense, exorbitant amounts of force and the French 75 or what's left of it is scrambling? And granted, we can view this film with the understanding that these characters have experienced Quintel in the ways that the activists of the 60s and 70s would have experienced leading into if the original text was moved to like the 90s or the 2000s in terms of the daughter having to flee and trying to find out these things about her mother. I don't know. I found what the film was saying about fascism to be kind of weak. I mean, it didn't hold up in depicting these white supremacists, but I found the undefeatability of Stephen Lockjaw to be a sentiment in itself about the ever-present nature of fascism and how it's seemingly undefeatable because there is always another snakehead along the 8-headed snake. And this isn't to say that it's not a reflection of reality, but I believe that radical depictions of revolutionary processes that wants to have a message that might be inspiring or interesting, or even just politically grounded, it makes me wonder, why do the politically elite so reliably lean into revolutionary depictions that eventually either question the commitment of the revolutionary or shows the malevolence of the fascist force, the malevolence of the state? It seldom shows narratives where the revolutionary escapes, where not as much is lost as we'd expect, or the revolutionary or militant power really puts up a fight against the state in a way that would surprise many liberal viewers. And I think what this film essentially tells us by the end is that if you are so committed to a revolutionary process, it will eventually fry you and your brain, remove a lot of your morals, and make you incapable of really being a decent parent. It's like on the most baseline, you could walk away from this film with that. And what does that really tell you about the value of the pursuit of a revolutionary life? And granted, this film doesn't depict fascism in a way where it's like, oh, let me run over there. But I do think it shows fascism with a certain kind of malevolence and radical life and ideology and pursuing that with a certain kind of deficiency that I think is depicted because that is the mainstream social expectation of what you're afforded when you seek power over others as opposed to power with others around you. When I was leaving this movie and talking about it with my friends, I kept saying, I don't know if I liked it. Like, I mean, it talked about revolutionary politics, it showed revolutionary things, but it felt like someone just read a book about the Weather Underground and then put it into a film. And even that analysis for me feels accurate, or it shows me that I was going in the right place, because I was reading a little bit into Vineland in preparation for making this video. And it is interesting because when you watch the film, and if you know quite a bit about US radical history, there were a lot of homages in terms of the direct actions that were at the beginning that immediately made me think of the Weather Underground. And it's based on the 1990 novel called Vineland. And Vineland is a novel by Thomas Pynchon, first published in 1990. It's political satire slash postmodern fiction set in California in 1984, the year of Reagan's reelection, but with extensive flashbacks to the 1960s counterculture. And the principal characters include Zaid Wheeler, a kind of burnout countercultural hangover, his daughter Prairie, Fernesse Gates, Zaid's ex-wife, once deeply involved in radical politics, who became an informant, and the federal agent Brock Van, who doggedly pursues the remnants of radicalism. There is a lot to be said about the fact that the base material for one battle after another is based off of Vineland, because I was reading a bit about the flack and critique and perspectives on this book, which I haven't read, and I just wanted kind of some context, because when I saw one battle after another, I was like, I don't know if this feels insanely well researched. I feel like there are certain tropes that certain movies fall into. And I did find this article by Booker Horror, and I just want to read a part of it. In short, characters in Vineland of the generation of Fernesse Gates and Zaid Wheeler figure in the 1960s as a time of lost past wholeness, even as the postmodernism that Jameson and others have associated with fragmentation was already in full swing. By the same token, characters like Sasha Gates, a generation older, just as whimsically recall the golden days of the 1930s, when leftist politics really meant something, and presumably Sasha's children, Prairie and Justin, will someday recall the 1980s as a similar golden age. Indeed, American culture of the 2010s and 2010s that has made the 1980s a key focus of cultural nostalgia. But effective potential action requires not only a recollection of the past, but also engagement with the present and the anticipation of the future. Nostalgia leads not to positive change, but merely to escapism. And Vineland suggests that much of the transgressive energy of the 1960s was in fact escapist, rather than activist. Thus, Pynchon's narrator suggests that Brock Vaughn's genius was to have seen in the activities of the 60s left not threats to the order, but acknowledged the desires for it. Brock saw the deep need only to stay children forever. Yes, if this was based on Vineland by Thomas Pynchon, then it was a depiction of the 60s set in the 80s. So the original text was kind of relying on looking at certain critiques of organizations like the Weather Underground. But what's interesting is that when you fast forward to today, we have so much of a deeper perspective on the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s. It being a revolutionary radical film, it felt like a comedy set in a radical setting. And the humor, the jokes, the sort of the potency of the revolutionary characters and the fascist characters at times comes across as campy, and at times comes across as really stirring and disturbing, meaning specifically Stephen Lockjaw's character. And I immediately left this film and I was like, was that revolutionary satire? And it makes sense that this was based on a Thomas Pynchon novel. Like, that book leans into satire, and it is off of a lot of the writing that Thomas Pynchon would do, which was really fantastical and would use otherworldly elements, and sometimes you would or wouldn't know what was real. And this makes sense if he's looking at the 60s and drug culture and sex and the escapism that he believes inevitably led to the failure of many of the revolutionary left elements. When we couch the text there, it makes sense because it's grounded in a critique that this author has experienced. Paul Thomas Anderson, I can't speak for specifically if he lived through the 60s or would understand that totally in a way that I wouldn't. But this film felt like it used revolutionary depictions and tactics as a sort of space to satirize a certain kind of commitment in order to have this underlying message about family and what we pass on and what continues. But the fact that the revolutionary politics weren't as emotionally grounded as they could be, the payoff didn't really feel that interesting or surprising or good. And this is why the film very much felt like revolutionary satire to me. And I kind of tried to write up a definition of revolutionary satire, and it reads, revolutionary satire in film refers to works that borrow the aesthetics and language of revolution, but strip them of their radical urgency. Instead of grappling with the material conditions, historical research, and emotional stakes that drive people to rebel, these films stage revolution as an ironic spectacle, a hollow performance of dissent. Their satire tends to dilute revolutionary truths into easy, consumable entertainment, leaving audiences with the feeling of rebellion rather than its substance. And there are three kind of qualities that I think of. So revolutionary demands are softened into vague calls for freedom or equality, severed from real histories or struggles. We have Perfidia Beverly Hills, this iconic Black character who is said to be part of a legacy of Black militants and revolutionaries, but we don't actually understand why or how or who. Is this just supposed to be the Black Panther Party? Was it the BLA? Was it something else? We have Bob Ferguson, who's really into bombs and weapons and rebelling and sabotage. But where did he train? Could there have been some kind of montage or one or two scenes at the beginning to ground us in his revolutionary ethic? Or was this film meant to have a forward momentum from the beginning that was already set in place and would inevitably lead to the end that it did? Could there have been surprises along the way? Could we have built a bit more empathy for these characters? And I feel like if we'd maybe had a political education scene set somewhere in there, if we had an earlier scene showing a moment where one of these characters resolved to a new kind of radicalism, that would have been interesting. But I think the systemic analysis in this film, the systemic kind of depictions were held by these characters that were fascists, that were white supremacists, but they were depicted in some ways comedically, which I think took away from some of the reality of the systems that these characters come from. And I think there's a careful line between comedy and making light of an ideology versus maybe a fascist going to this film and being like, oh my God, that was actually kind of cool the way those white dudes handled that shit. And then next is poor or shallow research. I kind of talked about this throughout this film, but this film very much felt like it was grounded in a lot of research and depictions related to the Weather Underground. And if anyone knows radical history in the 60s and 70s, you can understand that there were critiques of the Weather Underground by other Black radical militant organizations, specifically the Black Panther Party, after the Weather Underground did the Days of Rage, which I believe might have been in Chicago, which were meant to be these number of days where the Weather Underground for months said like thousands of people are going to gather, we're going to fuck shit up and it's going to be wild. A few hundred people showed up. They still went out and tried to do property damage and other things. And that action led to the state using that as an excuse to target other revolutionary elements. And so there are a lot of critiques of the Weather Underground for centering their whiteness or trying to overcompensate for their privileged upbringings and doing political violence in ways that really led to a lot of moral mistakes and ethical dilemmas that both opened up the movement to all sorts of qualms and problems and also opened up the state to come in and repress different kinds of bodies, different kinds of people even more. And I think when we have films that don't really dig into these histories, don't really hold specific moments that can kind of enlighten us to the past, there are missed opportunities. And I think what sucks is that, yeah, people in the Weather Underground were cool as fuck. They broke us out of Shakur out and other things. But to center that revolutionary depiction now just kind of shows that certain kind of bodies will lean towards certain depictions of the past. And even that research is shallow. Even that depiction of a revolutionary past is just one portion of a larger portrait. And there are a lot of opportunities to be sought after. I mean, I think they could have gone into the Young Lords. They could have depicted more of the environmental liberation movement. I mean, there are so many other radical factions that could have been pulled from that would have been interesting. And I think it's kind of like a trope of a lot of revolutionary cinema as well. It underemphasizes the complexity of radical or revolutionary spaces and overemphasizes the clarity or the malevolence of the state or fascism. And a part of this is, I think, an accepted worldview that shows up in even cinema. Spectacle over systemic analysis. Revolutionary satire emphasizes mass uprisings, dystopian aesthetics, or revolutionary chaos, while deeper mechanics of revolutionary change are sidelined. And I will say, the scene where Bob Ferguson ends up with his sensei, and then he ends up in their apartment, and we get to see this whole operation of these undocumented folks being able to flee and going through tunnels and other things. I thought that was a really amazing sequence, and I think that was one of the things that made the film more interesting. But still, the fact that he was a comedic character, the fact that he was the most effective and he was a side character, and he was Spanish speaking, just kind of lets me know, like, so that was a side plot, and it could have been the main point of the whole movie. And the spectacle was very much in the beginning. The montages, the activists making out, being hot, going in, and boo, 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 boo. It's all cute and fun, and you can wear your Levi's jeans and whatever the hell. But what are we left with when a movie shows us revolutionary aesthetics, but doesn't tell us why, doesn't tell us how, and doesn't let us into the characters in their most deep, troubled, and conflicted moments? And we saw bits of this in Act 1. We saw bits of this in Act 2. We saw bits of this in Act 3. But in my mind, a lot of it was overshadowed by the comedic elements. It was overshadowed by the thriller elements. And I think it would have been a lot more powerful if Willa's character had been a little bit more capable or able to push back against the forces that were toying with her throughout Act 3. And I think it would have been more interesting if there maybe had been a deeper scene where Bob Ferguson was confronted with his complacency and emotional abandonment of his daughter, as opposed to it being like a line or a throwaway scene or something. There were a lot of missed opportunities. So that'll be it for this video. I will give One Battle After Another a 3 out of 10 as an anarchist, as a revolutionary. It's not to say that I don't think this movie is worth seeing. I think it's worth not seeing if you're really against Leonardo DiCaprio's stances and you're just like really, really can't see this movie. I honestly felt like I needed to see it because of its depictions of Black nationalism, and I don't know, the way that the movie was talked about to me. It feels like a movie of our times that I was interested in seeing. And I'm glad I saw it because honestly, this week I've had a lot of weird thoughts about my value as an artist and what I'm doing and whether or not any of it fucking matters. And when I see a failed opportunity to depict radical or revolutionary politics in a way that is both good writing, entertaining, and politically grounded, it just makes me want to get back to writing and working even harder. And so that's going to be some of my intentions. I think later this year, I'm going to take a little bit of a YouTube break in November and December. I might have some more updates about that down the line. But I think it's really important to commit ourselves to our art, the things we're passionate about, infuse them with our radical politics, and not fucking hold back. Because if movies like this can come out, where the one battle after another is the white main character's incompetence and all the people around him have to scramble to help him, and that's considered a radical depiction. No, we need more. We need more. So thank you for watching another episode of Anarchism on Film. Once again, like, comment, and subscribe. I make videos about radical history, about direct action, the writing life, and much more. And once again, check out the link in the description to look up the Anarchism on Film list with my podcast, The Dugout. And check out The Dugout if you have time. Thank you for watching. See you later.